Hello.
Hi.
I'm glad
Hi.
that you're joining us. I can see we've got Hugo coming in as well. Um, it's an interesting story, Lindsay. We're going to do a bit of informal riffing while we're waiting because Charles Perry, our speaker for today, has been delayed um, in terms of train and wanted to find a quiet space. So I told him not to stress and just to join us in the conversation when he could. So it's just great to meet you and have you here. I would love to. I suppose if we just did a little bit of introductions, what are you wanting to get out the session, so I can ask Charles even better questions, and then we'll just all go around and introduce Stuart, Robert, Nina, and Juliet are volunteers that are helping out, so they've been attending the sessions as well. Juliet, Lindsay, but yeah, and I'm Tabitha. Nice to meet you.
So you're looking for volunteer introductions?
No, I'm no, God, I'm speaking too fast. I'm just looking to find out what's attracted you to join the conversation today, Lindsay.
Well, I hooked into the whole thing, the whole affair, and hoped to be able to look in on one or two sessions, just depending on availability. Despite being a retired person, it's amazing how availability of time doesn't seem to be always in the right slot. This is the first
Mhm.
one I've been able to look in on. I didn't choose carefully in terms of the subject of today's. It was just available to me to have an hour just now. So, but the environment concerns me. I'm a member of my local Rotary Club, and Rotary has a new focus to add to its various other focuses on the environment. And I've been given or have taken that responsibility within my Rotary Club. So I'm just trying to soak up everything I can, and looking for things that I would then be able to use to discuss with my Rotary Club, and other groups that I belong to. So I believe we're on a youth topic today, and we have young Rotarians. So hey.
Yes. Well, first of all, I believe you know Jimmy Johnson, or you're connected to Jimmy Johnson in some way. Do you know Jimmy?
Don't think so. Is there a
Okay,
Jimmy
so
Johnson present? I do see a Stuart Johnson.
no, Jimmy Johnson is joining a lot of the sessions, and he's from the Rotary. I think he's the West of Scotland lead, so I think that
Oh
might
well.
be
There
I
are
can.
hundreds and hundreds of Rotary clubs in Scotland.
Well,
So,
that
and
is good to know. And do you know what's really interesting, Lindsay? I mean, what we're doing is we're creating all of these conversations. They're recorded so that they can be used as databases to stimulate conversation in the future. So, if that's of interest, just let us know how we can help you use the conversations that we've already had, because we've had some amazing conversations as discussion points for the Rotary Club. I'd love to pick that up afterwards and see if there's a way to do that. And welcome, Hugo. It's great to see you joining us. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about why you're inspired to join the conversation today.
Hi, greetings from Mexico. It's a pleasure to speak with you and also all the community in Scotland. I noticed your accent, so it's well, it's great to speak with about fossil fuels, and because this conversation about the future generation in my country, there's a policy that allows that promotes the fossil fuels energy consumption, and because there's how can I say, in the late 1930s, we expropriate the oil and gas companies from foreign companies, and it's a myth in Mexico that the oil is it's for all the Mexicans in a similar way like Norway in the past. However, this time the government pushed some laws to create a more nationalistic point of view of the oil consumption and oil energy in the country. So I'm trying to figure out and speak about the community on communities to let them know about what's happening in Mexico, and to be aware about nationalism for making a grown climate agenda.
Wow. Well, first of all, bienvenido. Me alegro que está aquí.
Nice Spanish.
Muchas gracias, porque antes vivía en Galicia, en España, por mucho tiempo. Anyway, I'm going to stay. Sorry, I get excited when I can speak Spanish. What would be a great way to start the conversation, I think, seeing as we're here? I'm really curious to hear more about what's going on in terms of what's happening with the oil industry in Mexico, because I think it's something that it's very easy to only hear about what's happening in your own country, and the news can be very selective. So what you talked about there, Hugo, is that you said that there's this myth that Mexico is like Norway, where, you know, the oil is, and the benefits of the oil is fairly distributed, but it's not really a story. So would you like to share more about how your understanding oil is working in Mexico?
Yeah, for about 70 years, from the 1930s to 2000, the state company called Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, all Mexican oil, to be properly translated, was a key part of the development of Mexico. In the late 1970s, there was the Mexican Miracle, which was part of the discovery of many oil, how can I say it, zones in the Gulf of Mexico, where the oil can be distributed and exported to foreign countries. So, as you remember, in the late 1970s, the OPEC, this organization for oil and oil countries had this issue that promotes that increases the oil prices all the world. So Mexico take advantage of this matter and sell oil for countries that need this kind of oil for the industry. However, because of that advantage, the state company created a model that only benefits the elites and benefit the politicians around this state company, Pemex. So in 2011, the government promotes energy reform to attract more investment in Mexico. So companies like BP, Shell, and Eni, to name some of them, invested in Mexico and create a beneficial economy that increases the perspective for Mexicans to know more about to invest more in Mexico. But from 2018, the new president, Mr. López Obrador, determined that Mexico was very disgraced by this energy reform, and then pushed an alternative to focus to strengthen Pemex in this matter. So Pemex was the only company that can sell oil, petrol, and some derivatives such plastic, but no other company can do that. So the open market that was in 2011, 2012 was closed, and only one company from the state it's the only responsible. And also to sum up on this matter, the state company has a big loss about $1,000 US pounds per second, because in the last 3 months, I think. Let me check. Let me check the data.
Okay, so I think what's interesting, and I want to make sure that I've understood properly what you're saying there, Hugo, is you're saying that there's been an energy reform that kind of was made, but it sounds as if there's been a lot of corruption, and the politicians have been looking to line their pocket, make the oil industry very nationalized so that money flows in certain ways. And even though this energy reform came in and some of the big oil companies were able to come in and create a beneficial relationship, your latest prime minister, or whatever the title is, I'm using the UK term there, president, has basically said that this is a bit of a disgrace. This isn't how the energy should be functioning. And what you're then saying is that this company isn't even functioning effectively. There's huge losses that are happening every single day, probably because of mismanagement, if I understand it correctly. Is that a good summary?
It's correct. Very fine.
Perfect. No, that is good to know. I wonder if anybody's got anything to comment or to add to the conversation.
Actually, I do.
What surprise!
No. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Juliette Brie. So I volunteer for Net Zero Nation. What's actually important for this conversation is that I actually used to live in Malaysia, and Malaysia has an oil and gas company that's called Petronas. And the way that Malaysia functions is very interesting. There's different groups of peoples that have different standings in society. So there's the Malaysian Indians, there's the Malaysian Chinese, and then there's the Bumiputra, who are the Malays. So Bumiputra and Malay means people of the earth. So it's really the Malays that were born in Malaysia. And so the way that society functions, only, I think it's about 60% of the government is formed of the Bumiputra, and then it goes 15% Malaysian Indians, and then 15% Malaysian Chinese, and then the rest is any other groups that exist within Malaysia. So Petronas, the oil and gas company that is owned by the Malaysian government, is actually mostly composed of Bumiputra. And so recently they've actually tried to implement sustainability measures in order to steer away from the idea of fossil fuels, just like we've seen with a lot of different fossil fuel companies in Europe, like the French oil and gas company Total, now being called Total Energies, because they're veering towards solar energy and also wind energy. And so they're trying to do that in Malaysia as well in order to really improve their image. But what's actually interesting is that Petronas, so as I said, is mostly composed of the Bumiputra people in Malaysia. And there's a high level of corruption. So because it's Malaysia, it's a very corrupt state. But Petronas actually has a lot of investments, whether it's in palm oil. They've even invested in a lot of movies, specifically in India. And so they just have like a lot of different forms of investments. So there's been a fight within Malaysia to steer clear of fossil fuels, and it's actually turned into an environmental justice fight, because not only is it a fight for the planet, but it's also a fight for the other groups in society that aren't represented to the same extent as the Bumiputra. So the Malaysian Indians and the Malaysian Chinese. And so it's just a very interesting, different perspective of something that's going on the other side of the world from Mexico, but it's also this idea of climate and environmental justice.
Perfect. No, thank you, Juliette. And welcome, Charles. You've joined us. It's great to have you here. I'm excited for the conversation. To give you a bit of you're on mute. So if you want to speak, you might want to mute yourself, Charles.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
No worries. You've turned up at the perfect time, because we've been setting the scene, Charles, for the conversation. So let me just bring you up to speed by giving you a little bit of a summary. Hugo has joined us from Mexico, and he's just talking about the way that the corruption within the political system, they are nationalized. The oil companies made it national based, how it's not really been functioning in terms of serving the people. The energy reform happened there, and it was supposed to be a beneficial relationship, but some of the, the bigger fossil fuel companies kind of came in. It wasn't that good, and the company is functioning at such a level that it's hitting a loss, and it's really impacting the country. And from that, Juliet was then just talking about her experience and understanding of what was happening in Malaysia, where I didn't have a chance to process all of this, but you were talking again about high levels of corruption going on within the system there, how the fossil fuels companies are diversifying and trying to control agendas, and not really working in service of the people. So with that said, Charles, I just want to jump in. That's the context that you've arrived.
Yep.
So the question that we're having the conversation about is, do we need to set a date to ban fossil fuels to safeguard our future generations?
Yeah, it's a great question, because clearly the urgency is on us, on all of us, and there's a co-responsibility when we see the writing on the wall, which we do now, which is clearly unsustainable use of fossil fuels and combustion way in excess of what the Earth's limits can accommodate. We need to take the sort of proportionate response. And when there's a problem, and the problem is quite simple, burning too much fossil fuels, I mean, the answer is stop burning fossil fuels. Then the question is how to bring that about. I actually used to work for BP, and I spent 6 years there. And so in regards to Mexico, I mean, let's talk about the oil spill, right? Well, the worst oil spill in history. I wasn't actually at BP when that happened. I left a few years before that happened. And I was there under previous leadership, where the leadership was really trying to change, I thought, and I was assisting with that, the company, the Beyond Petroleum journey. But it's taken another 20 years since I left in 2006. So 15 years later, and look where we are. We're heading in the wrong direction as a global community. And so sooner or later, the big stick, I think, needs to come out. I guess the question is, how do we pressure politicians to have the courage to use the big stick to prevent the abuse of human and environmental issues by big oil?
I like that. There's a lot there, Charles, and what you've just said. How do we get politicians to get the big stick out to put the pressure on that's needed? And it ties in so perfectly just with one of our earlier sessions where we were looking at, how can you use the law to empower young people to create action? And what I'm hearing you say is that we're really needing to put the pressure on politicians. We're really needing to activate, mobilize, in the words of Net Zero Community, and use the power that we have as the people to really get the politicians to act on our behalf instead of self-interest.
I mean, there was a moment, Tabitha, in history, which keeps coming to mind, which was the early 1800s with William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. And why I bring that up is because when the moral case, I bring the moral case into this, right? Because effectively it's now becoming immoral to continue as we're doing. We're harming ourselves, our neighbors, and the future generations. This is called the future, all of those different stakeholders, by our continued excess. Now, in William Wilberforce's day, they came to a point where it was no longer tenable to carry on with the economy of human labor in the form of slavery. So even though it was just 1 month before he died, unfortunately, 1 month before the Abolition of Slavery Act was passed, he knew by the end of his life that the Abolition of Slavery Act was going to go through the British House of Commons, right? And he knew that because he had got the biggest incumbent, his arch foe, the British East India Company. He had actually won them round eventually. The Charles Grant, the chief executive, realized, thanks to William Wilberforce and his abolitionists lobbying, that there was a better way. And that is because the industrialized era was upon us. And so the steam engine and industrialization, moving to machines, was the future as of then. So moving from human and animal energy to the industrialized era. Now fast forward, we've got another totally immoral and unsustainable situation where the economic case and the moral case are colliding because there's a better way. It's cheaper, it's environmentally, zero emissions in the form of renewable energy. So there's every argument is in favor of us shifting away from fossil fuels, but we can't for some reason bring ourselves to abandon fossil fuels because it's so entrenched in our everyday behavior. We're addicted, we're dependent to such an addiction that we can't break the habit, right? So someone, and I think it is the big stick in the form of regulation, has to, like with smoking, when smoking was banned in restaurants and bars, it happened very quickly and people didn't really complain. It just happened. And you get to a tipping point where suddenly something has to change, like no more burning of fossil fuels. But we need to give ourselves some time. So it's not going to happen tomorrow, and politicians aren't brave enough to start implementing the abolition of the combustion of fossil fuels tomorrow. But why couldn't they do that by 2050, 2040 in some cases? Depending on where we are geographically, which sector, I think the stick needs to start coming down in different geographies and different sectors. And the folks who've caused most of the problem, i.e. Great Britain and the West, who pioneered the industrialized era, we, I think, need to take the responsibility for bringing it to an end soonest here before China and India, etc.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thanks, Charles. And Lindsay, I've noticed you've had your hand up there, so I'd love for you just to come in.
Yeah, I did that so that I wouldn't forget something. That was really interesting about the Wilberforce analogy. That's a good story to tell, actually. But it was just before that when you were discussing whether politicians are the ones who need to actually use the stick with big business. I'm thinking it's actually more individuals and consumers who are likely to have an impact on big business, because as soon as customers start saying, now we don't want your gas boiler, blah, 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 etc., that's when companies will sit up and take notice, I would suggest. Politicians have a short lifespan because their focus is always on getting re-elected, and they have other fish to fry at the same time, so they have to walk a tightrope all the time between one body and another body, one entity and another entity, and I don't think they're in a great position, although obviously their constituents will talk to them in the same way as their constituents will talk to the businesses that they purchase from. So I think actually individuals have a lot more power than we tend to say. That's all.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you make a lot of sense with that argument. Lindsay.
Brilliant. Is there any other questions kind of coming in? Feel free to just raise your hand and jump in. If not, we'll keep on going, because you're talking about there, Charles, that we're needing to set this date, and maybe, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe by 2050, 2045. And what you'd actually said is that we need to look at it. It can't be universal or global. We have to maybe set different targets for different countries. So can you just explain a little bit more about how potentially you could see this working for us to set these dates?
Yeah. Look, I think it's got something to do with the same discussion that we're having right here at COP. And I'm actually sitting in, believe it or not, I'm sitting in Scottish SSE's head office here, just around the corner from the Blue Zone, on my way to, I think Tabitha, I was just about to get on a train to go to Blair Estate, where I'm going to an afternoon meeting. And they kindly said, come and do the talk here, but I was a few minutes late, so apologies for that. I think, the discussion here is all about net zero by when. Now, it's easy to criticize the whole net zero concept, but it does bring in the the leaders, so the world leaders, you know, we didn't have everybody, but we had 120 world leaders talking about dates by when their economies were going to become net zero. So in a similar fashion, you extend that theory, which is, okay, dates by when your economies are going to be fossil fuel free. Now, Costa Rica has already led the world, for example, on becoming a fossil free nation. And other countries are trying to do that. Other communities are trying to kick the habit and become fossil free. I mean, there's universities, there's island communities, there's all sorts of examples. And I'm pretty sure Costa Rica is potentially not the first one. I just know Costa Rica keeps on coming up as the story, the case study of how they broke the habit on fossil fuels. And I think it's, you know, back to the point about individuals. Individuals do have the power to act for their own choices and their families' choices. But when it comes to the community and the country in which one participates, which one pays on taxes, which one is employed by, somehow we got to get the collective to act in the same, you know, uniformly, to act together. And so I do believe in people power, and I do believe in pressuring a country or a community to get there quicker, because frankly, we've seen the costs of being hooked on fossil fuels. I mean, the financial costs are clearly rising, and as I said, it's cheaper to move to green energy than to stay on fossil fuels, and that's not even taking into account the social costs and the environment costs, the externalities that have not been internalized in what they call true cost, right? So whole costing, full costing of the impacts, both the benefits and the costs of one's, you know, being hooked on fossil fuels versus moving to a clean economy. And I think if those communities, you know, really push hard to be the first, or to compete with, are you going to be net zero by 2040 or 2030 or 2050? We heard India saying net zero by 2070, and it's kind of, I think all of us who heard that, you know, we got, you know, it was a really sort of down in the moment, hearing India, and I'm still reeling from that. Some people say, well, at least they've got net zero by something, but frankly, 2070, I mean, none of us are really going to be around, and of course, that's way too late. So I think at least net zero has started the trajectory of a science-based pathway, which we all need. But I think now it's up to those individuals and communities to push their communities and economies to kick the habit much faster and to try and get fossil fuel free. And I do think it helps when you get the stick out as well as the carrot for that. And so as a policy instrument, we'll help you because we're going to penalize the bad stuff and we're going to incentivize the good stuff to help you change your behavior, because we're creatures of habits, and old habits die hard, the old adage, right? So it's quite hard for us to just junk our gas boilers. I mean, I've been doing renewable energy for a long time, but I've still got a gas boiler in my house. I'm not proud of that fact, but it's been quite hard to think of a way to get rid of my gas boiler, to be quite honest. It would help if I had, you know, more government intervention. Britain's just announced the £5,000. It's very low to replace a gas boiler, you know, with a £5,000 grant, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a start, I suppose.
Well, it's a start, and I think there was quite a few interesting points that you mentioned there, Charles, and one of them is, yes, it's about individual agency and the power of individuals coming together into collective action. And I think that's that link, and collaboration has been talked about again and again throughout all of the Future series and all of the conversations that we've been having. But that distinction there of, if we actually get people, communities coming together, I mean, I wrote down gamification, you know, how do we turn this into an adventure, into a journey? And that's part of what we're really wanting to do within the Scottish Net Zero community in terms of catalyzing, you know, a movement of movements. And there's something really kind of quite inspiring about making it friendly competition of how can we collaborate more effectively, you know, so that we can create potentially maybe decentralized systems, test out new solutions in small scale, and I suppose what that's kind of like sparking in my mind is, imagine if you had 70 local communities that were all trialing something on the race to zero that was fit for purpose for their community, and what you could potentially achieve then through that collective action. And I know that, you know, we had Climate Action Straven who were speaking at our event at the Lighthouse on the 2nd, where they were really talking about how they were mobilizing the community and also talking about that need to have the stick as well. So it's like friendly competition in community and also amplifying the voice to really put the pressure on the people. Beyond that, where I want to come back to is, you talked about we need the science-based aspects of the journey of net zero. So, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, we need science-based targets, and sometimes people don't even understand what that is. So for the people who are just kind of stepping the toes into the net zero world, why is it so important to have science-based targets?
Because it's all about the outcome, in the sense of temperature increase, right? So you've heard a lot about 1.5, 2 degrees, and all of these different temperature scenarios have pathways. And so the science sort of says that if we want to have a chance of sticking to the 1.5, which is Paris's best outcome, as opposed to the 2 degrees, which already is a bad outcome, then there's parts per million that we need to, from a science-based pathway point of view, parts per million that we need to track in the atmosphere. We're at, you know, globally we're at 420 parts per million address at the blue zone, but he said, you know, there's one number that makes everything.
We're just losing you a little bit there. You said there's one number,
the number
Charles,
of parts per million temperature increase, right? Yeah. So at the moment, globally, we've got to 420 parts per million. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So 420 is the number. And we have to drive that down if we want to have a chance of sticking to 1.5, right? We're already in excess. We're heading for 2.7 degrees at the moment, minimum, in terms of the outcome. And so in driving a science, part of that country's economy, so business, society, etc., is encouraged to develop their own science-based pathways that support that scenario of 1.5. So when you sign up to the Race to Zero, it's called the Business Ambition for 1.5 as a business, right? So you make a pledge around your business being net zero by 2050, taking a 1.5 pathway, and then you have targets, interim targets along the journey between now and 2050 to hit. Those targets are called carbon intensity reduction targets. And, you know, the first every 5 years. And so you plot your pathway on the map of whether you're going to succeed in your net zero by 2050 pledge. And if you fail in the first few years, you've got to take more corrective action, and you've got to do that across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for every business, right? So the offsetting thing is not doing what comes first, which is scope 1. So the other part of the science-based pathways is you have to start with your own direct emissions, which is scope 1. You can't just outsource the problem by offsetting it.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm just hearing you say that what's really key is it's important to start your net zero journey now, because it's going to be a lot easier the sooner you start. If you leave it longer, it's going to be harder because of these targets and these outcomes. Rob, I see you've got your hand up, so I just want to come to you, Rob.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I just had a question because I have, coming out of my master's on carbon management, we've often talked about having a society which has no fossil fuels in it. And one of the main issues at the time that we discussed during that master's was the issue of the grid and of intermittency. And I'm wondering if there is a set out plan to tackle that that problem. Is it still a problem? And what do we do about intermittency other than getting large batteries? How does Costa Rica do that?
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant question. I mean, absolutely, that is such a big challenge. It's still the primary challenge because of exactly what you said, the intermittency of renewable energy, when the wind blows, when the sun shines, and you need to store that energy. So storage is what we're talking about here. And there are different ways to do that. And you mentioned batteries, and there's spinning reserve, and there's hydro, and there's all sorts of different ways with, for example, hydrogen as well as a carrier. So I think that is where the focus is now in terms of investment. Well, it's one of the big focus areas and opportunities commercially to bring the costs of the storage solutions down. So I was one of a few people that got a company called GridServe. We co-founded GridServe, where it's now known for supercharging of electric vehicles on highways, because GridServe bought Dale Vince's charging highways business. But when we started it, it was actually about exactly what you were referring to, which was to plug into to basically be a support for the grid with this intermittency issue. So with the two-way, the grid was designed for a one-way flow of electrons. I'm sure you've studied that, and you know quite a lot about this problem from your masters. With the two-way flow of electrons, you have to stabilize the grid with the help of batteries, for example. So there was a whole market created by National Grid in frequency stabilization. So EFR and FFR, enhanced frequency and firm frequency response assets in the form of batteries to help the grid stabilize, and then also to help with that storage issue. So that also led to what's called the behind the meter opportunity, which is effectively security of your own supply. If you're a business, let's say you're making beer for argument's sake, or whiskey, and you've got your own plant for that, you really want to be behind the meter so that you can, if there's any issues with the grid, you still have your power, right? And your sort of your heat and light, regardless of what happens to the grid. So that securing of your own supply, whether you're a business or whether you're a community or whether you're a country, is about that decentralization point that you made. So bringing the energy closer to the point of use, and then being able to use it when you need it and export it when you don't need it. So there's an arbitrage opportunity where you can actually make some money out of selling that to the grid when the price is right, and using it, to the best of advantage when you need it. Does that help?
Yeah, and just one quick follow-up question, if I may. I just wanted to ask, how scalable is that in a time frame that we need for for climate to not be too detrimental with the amount of fossil fuels we're using?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think it is scalable if you take a multi-technology approach. I mean, if you just try and rely on lithium-ion batteries, forget it, right? And that's going to cause all sorts of other issues, supply chain issues with lithium and mining of lithium, and social issues, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, we all know there's no silver bullet. So we can't just say it's about the lithium batteries. It's about this multi-technology in using it in a hybrid way. I think hybridization is the key word here, because if you deploy a range of technologies in harmony with each other, so the generation technology of solar and wind, the storage technology of battery or spinning reserve or hydro or hydrogen, etc., you can create in that community the perfect solution for that community, right? Which is a virtuous circle. And I think that's what we need to do on a localized level. And then those local solutions can be scalable. But it's not going to be a one size fits all. It's going to be fairly bespoke, depending on whether it's Costa Rica or Scotland, right? Depending on what the resources locally available to those communities are.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Are there any other questions coming up listening to the conversation?
I was wondering, because a lot of the time when we talk about replacing fossil fuels, nuclear energy is often spoken about as the big bad guy also. But I was wondering, what's your opinion on it? Because I know a lot of people who are anti-fossil fuels also tend to be quite anti-nuclear. So I wonder if you view that as sort of acceptable replacement, because you can. Because
it's a great question. Is it Stuart? Yeah. Hi there, Stuart. Stuart, look, the problem that we have is pollution, right? In all of its forms. That's the simple, clear answer to the problem, which is pollution. Then when you unpack pollution, I mean, the issue with nuclear is clearly pollution, just like it is with fossil fuels. I mean, if nuclear had no radioactive waste, then I'd be fairly supportive. I mean, it's the wrong model because it's typically centralized. It's typically far away from the point of consumption, and it's it takes about 10 years to actually produce any energy from the moment you sort of strike ground and you get your initial planning permission. Is probably even longer than 10 years. But take Hinkley, how long Hinkley is taking and how over budget it is. So typically these big nuclear power stations are always over budget, and it's not a zero emission solution because, of course, you first got to build the nuclear power station. It takes over 10 years, as I said, and it's mainly concrete, right? Highly polluting exercise to build a nuclear power station. Then when it comes to the radioactive waste, you've got to treat that for its entire future. So when energy ministers come into the job in the UK, they learn, and a lot of them have not had energy backgrounds, they learn pretty fast that most of their budget is already consumed before they've even got into the job, because it's treating historic costs around radioactive waste, right? So, this becomes a baggage for future generations. So I think the quicker we wean ourselves off anything that's polluting, whether it's about carbon dioxide pollution, whether it's about radioactive waste pollution, we really need technologies that are non-polluting. And if we harness the sun and the wind and the waves and the tides, they don't come with any form of pollution attached to them. That's why I think that we should only concentrate on forms of energy that have no pollution costs and that are provided free by nature. The other problem with nuclear is, of course, none of that is provided free by nature.
Thank you. And Lindsay, you've got your hand up again.
Okay, so yesterday I went hill walking and I found myself eventually in the middle of a forest of wind turbines, which is quite spectacular. But they look to me as if they're made of concrete. And I assume that they will have a lifespan and that we will move on to less polluting materials, probably involving the ocean, tidal and wave, rather than these onshore. But is that a big issue? Should I be less in favour of wind turbines than I currently am?
I think it's all relative. Do you remember the cartoon of, oh, those wind turbines are spoiling my view, but over there's a coal-fired power station that's been there for generations, right? And so, when you compare a wind farm to what we've historically had, which is coal and then natural gas, I mean, it's obvious, which is the cleaner alternative, right? Even though at the moment, wind farms, as you say, because you've got to, put the concrete in and then you've got to put up the steel turbine, it's not zero pollution, but it's a hell of a lot less than building a nuclear power station, of course, right? It's a minimal amount of concrete, and it's steel, which is both, steel is making quite a lot of progress towards decarbonization in the latest round of innovations around decarbonizing heavy industry. So I think we can get to zero carbon cement, zero carbon steel solutions, or replacement materials that take out the carbon intensity, and we can do the zero pollution solution, if you like, much quicker with the forms of energy that are harnessing nature in a clean way than by sticking with the historic technologies that are fundamentally far more polluting.
Okay, so we're stepping in the right direction with wind farms.
huge,
No, you've just gone into a robotic
right
voice there.
direction.
Could you
as I said,
restart,
comparing,
Charles?
you've got to have. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure what the Wi-Fi situation is. Not brilliant here. That's because I didn't get the passcode in time for dialing in.
Do you know,
So,
it's working. You're back to normal now. It's just if you restart so we don't have the robot voice.
Yeah, and I was just saying, I think it's Juliet. Apples to apples, right? So, if you're going to look for the faults with a wind farm, then compare that to the incumbent technologies that we've relied on for generations, which are, about, I don't even know what the ratio is, but in terms of
we're
pollution,
losing you again, Charles. I'm just going to summarize what I think I heard. You broke up here. I said, I think what you said is, if you're concerned about the potential impact of wind turbines, it's worthwhile comparing them to the existing types of energy sources that we have at this precise moment and do an analysis. And then that way you can actually see that there's a capacity and a difference there.
Correct.
Perfect. Nina or Juliet, you've got your hand up. And if we take one more question before we start wrapping up for today.
Yep. So hi, Julia again. So I come from France, which is a country that's pretty big on nuclear energy, to say the least. We do have 56 nuclear plants. And I specifically come from the Northeast, which is a dumping ground for nuclear waste. So you would actually expect the populations there to be anti-nuclear. We've actually found that people are very pro-nuclear, not only because it creates jobs with the waste facilities, but also because it's forced them to be more creative with regards to energy and how to remove waste. So noticing what you said, just in general, do you think that France should keep on going with nuclear, since we already have all of our nuclear plants in place, so we don't need the 10-wait period to build those plants? Or do you think that France should start considering a transition towards more sustainable energy, more wind like power or some solar power?
What a brilliant question. I'm glad you used the word sustainable. I think
Oh, I think we're losing you again, Charles.
word, because I don't think nuclear is sustainable. So nuclear is sustainable because you use the word sustainable there, my favorite word with this. So I do think France should look at decentralization, because nuclear is typically highly centralized. And clearly, France has already gone the nuclear route. So it'll be a slower transition. But I do think the future is the decentralization of energy generation, bringing it closer to the communities which it serves. And so I think a mixture, in France's case, of not all centralized, but starting to transition some of the energy to decentralized, sustainable, which nuclear is not for various reasons, particularly on cost, but also on the supply chain issues around nuclear, let alone the waste issues going upstream and downstream. Nuclear, I don't think is sustainable. So yes, moving to decentralized, sustainable would be, I think, a good thing to consider.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's definitely something that France has struggled for the past few decades. That's definitely decentralization, since we do have a massive centralization problem. So thank you very much for that answer.
Pleasure.
I'm just grateful for you taking the time today, Charles, to log in. And I think what I'm taking away, if I summarize the entire conversation that we've kind of like had into a snapshot summary, it's like, if we have individual agency and turn that into collective action, we cannot just put pressure on politicians to take the action that we want, but actually we could come together to start creating our own energy sources, so start potentially doing group purchasing and moving in a way to decentralize, so that we can have a both and grid that functions in a way that is sustainable, using that word that you said there, and creates no pollution, so that we can actually move away from our addiction to fossil fuels.
I think very well summarized, Tabitha.
Perfect. Thank you again so much for your time, Charles. Thank you everybody else for joining in. Thank you, Hugo, for our impromptu learning on Mexico, Juliet, Nina, Lindsay. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and hope to see you in some of the other sessions. And for those of you watching the recordings, I really hope that you've enjoyed it. Take care, everyone.